Staying with you, Matt, and on China now, Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, he's promised to continue defence investments in the region to counter China's rise. There's quite strong language from Richard Marles, I've got to say, this morning, especially after Wang Yi gave us those 4 points to agree to over the weekend. The ice is definitely not thawing, is it?
Well, as you know, Australia's rejected those 4 points. We will make decisions based on what's in the best interest of the Australian people and our defence and security. And there's no doubt that over the last decade, China has become much more assertive in its posture within our region. That's meant that Australia has to be conscious of that and act to ensure that we're protecting the interests of the Australian people into the future. And that's why we're strengthening our alliances within the region through the AUKUS partnership and the like. We'll obviously continue to have a dialogue with the Chinese government, and there's been encouraging signs there recently with Penny Wong and Wang Yi meeting, and Richard and the defence counterpart from China. But we need to stand up for our values and our interests. And those values, of course, are democracy, the rule of law, and freedom of expression and freedom of speech. They're fundamental to Australian society, and we'll continue to stand up for those.
Sure. Hollie, the Pacific Island Forum, it's on this week. Albanese is heading there this afternoon. The Solomon Islands and Kiribati are in with China now. Was that a failure of your government that Labor is now having to patch up?
No, international relations at any time are very, very fraught and can be when you particularly factor in China and their attitude towards the Australian government over the past few years, but also the way that China behaved with regards to our export industries and the sanctions that they put on those. Just because we questioned the origins of COVID, we need to remember where a lot of this started. But when you look at some of these Pacific Island nations, we need to be careful we don't approach them with some sort of paternalistic viewpoint. These are sovereign nations. And we know China has been very active across the globe with its Belt and Road initiatives. So we do need to make sure, though, that some of the countries that are starting to enter into these agreements, that they are aware of what some of the implications can be when they can't repay the loans and yet have allowed critical infrastructure to be developed by China. But I'm interested as well. We see Mr Albanese out there talking about climate change. We've now got the Pacific nations, some of them looking to go to the International Court with regards to different targets not being met by certain countries. Yet we're seeing other Pacific Island nations actively engaging with China, and they have very, very little move towards net zero. So is this something that Australia is putting itself forward for, or is it something that Pacific nations are trying to impose on Australia while not setting the same standard for China, who are world emitters significantly higher than Australia and are continuing to invest in coal-fired generation?
No, that's a fair enough point. I'll put that one to you, Matt. Yeah, so Pacific nations want us to do more on climate. New fossil fuel projects are non-starters, according to them. So how can they argue that while some nations, and I go to Solomon Islands and Kiribati again, turn to China, which is piling on more and more coal?
Well, when you meet with any of the Pacific leaders, and this is over the course of the last decade, they'll always say to you the number one issue for them is stronger action on climate change, because it's a threat to their life and their livelihood. You know, you've got nations like the Marshall Islands where you've got inundation now of the sea level. You've got crops that are being destroyed because of salination of the land. And it's affecting their livelihood, and they've wanted stronger action on climate change.
But shouldn't they be more critical of China?
Australia is the leader. Well, you know, it's about ensuring that all nations throughout the world take stronger action on climate change. And yes, China has to be a part of that, as does Europe and as does Australia. And they've seen, unfortunately, in Australia that in the previous government there was this war on climate change. There was this debate that went on with Matt Canavan saying that, you know, climate change isn't real, that we need to be investing more in coal, when Pacific Island nations are seeing that as an immediate threat to their livelihood. So they've just wanted an Australian government that takes this issue seriously and will bring it up in international fora like the Quad, like the Pacific Islands Forum, like the G20, so that they've got a strong voice within the region, and Australia as the lead economy can do that. And that's what they've wanted, and the new government are keen to do that, and Anthony Albanese's speech at the Pacific Islands Forum this week will reflect that.
And what would you be urging, Hollie? Should these Pacific Island nations be speaking up more when it comes to China?
Well, I just don't think you can have it both ways. And when you want to look at the percentage of global emissions, we're 1.3%. Versus China, significantly higher than us. And global warming isn't something caused by one country, one economy, one region. If we're going to look at this, it needs to be tackled globally. We know how many countries are now turning back to coal, particularly in light of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Germany, who was so reliant on renewables, is now restarting its coal-fired power stations. So perhaps investing in coal might not have been a bad idea. Yet Australia, that has some of the most amazing coal in the world, we seem to be the only country determined to give ourselves an economic disadvantage by not producing cheap, affordable, reliable baseload power, by moving away from those coal and fossil fuels generators, while the rest of the world are quite frankly turning back to coal because there's gas shortages. Renewables do not exist in a transmissible form that can deliver that kind of energy, regardless of what anyone says. You can say it all you'd like, the technology doesn't exist. So we need to live in the real world, not off with the fairies and the pixie dust and what might be available in the future. It doesn't exist at the moment. And if we want to, as a country, give ourselves an economic disadvantage, well, I think we're very, very silly.
Okay, Hollie and Matt, appreciate your time this morning. We will have to leave it there, though. Thank you. We'll talk to you again soon.